A teddy bear stuffed with stolen loot crosses the border under the noses of customs agents. A blonde teenager with a half-baked plan walks into a bank to pay off her mortgage at gunpoint. And down in Texas, a gang of, quote, respectable citizens, end quote, trades their briefcases for getaway cars. Crime was bold, bizarre, and sometimes just plain dumb in July of 1927's Decades of History. The Daily Alaska Empire starts us off with its July 2nd, 1927 paper and its story titled Bank Robbers Carry Loot in Teddy Bear. This is a rare excursion for us outside of the United States, and in this case, it takes us to Berlin, Germany. Well, the teddy bear was stuffed with 400,000 Polish zloty, Z-L-O-T-Y, which was equal then to about 50,000 US dollars. This tactic was used repeatedly by a trio of bank robbers, totaling 1.5 million or about $175,000 that was stolen in Poland and was taken across the border to Germany. So how were they caught? Well, a man stepped up to the cashier's cage at the Disconto Bank at Frankfurt on Main. He was trying to change 500,000 Polish zloty into German marks. The cashier became suspicious, so the bank communicated with its Breslau branch, and they were informed that, in fact, the notes were okay. But it did call attention or hearkened back to a recent bank heist that occurred at Kroluska Huta. An investigation followed, leading to the arrest of a postal clerk named Karl Kessler, who had in his possession a key to the vault at Kroluska Huta. He confessed to having hid money with his friend Gottfield Sislik, who gave it to his wife for safekeeping. Well, the same night, both men headed out of the area. So a few days later, Mrs. Sislik stuffed as many of those Polish zloty as she could into the teddy bear, which she then gave to her little girl to carry along with the group that was crossing the border without issue. The crew repeated this act until they had moved that 1.5 million zloty from Poland to Germany. The Evening Star and the Douglas Daily Dispatch ran identical stories using clever changes in the titles. Well, the Bismarck Tribune ran a story that was so small that it didn't even have a title. We do see that this July 20 story comes out of St. Paul, Minnesota, where we see that writs of habeas corpus to hopefully prevent the extradition of 4 men to Huron, South Dakota, in order to stand trial for bank robbery, had been quashed in the district court at St. Paul. They were at least given an opportunity for an appeal. We've covered a bunch of heists in Minnesota and the Dakotas, so as more information becomes available, we'll update. For now, we'll stick with the Word Frugal Bismarck Tribune and its July 26th edition, and a possible connection to the above snippet. Hearings Continued takes us to Moorhead, Minnesota, where we see a preliminary hearing for Mrs. Willie Mae Williams for actual highway robbery. It was in connection with the daylight heist of the Sabin State Bank that occurred on July 14th. The hearing was to be continued until Friday, August 5th. And the preliminary hearing for one Ray Potter, held as an alleged accessory in the bank robbery, was also continued to that same date. Well, moving to the July 27 edition of the Tribune, bank robberies charged. It appears that Burnett Brumette, who'd been arrested in Moorhead, Minnesota, quote, a week ago under the name W.A. Taylor, end quote, was actually a man named Frank Murray, and he was set to be returned to, strangely, Oklahoma. There, Murray faced charges of engaging in 3 daylight bank robberies in 1 month, according to Sheriff M.T. Ridpath of Chandler, Oklahoma. In fact, Sheriff Ridpath was in Moorhead, Minnesota to accompany Murray, back to Oklahoma. We covered a heist in Chandler, Oklahoma in the video Machine Guns, Murder, Mistaken Moonshine, when two men robbed the Avery State Bank for then an undetermined amount. And about 40 miles away, there was a heist that involved five men, quote, armed with machine guns, end quote, who successfully got away with $1,000. Was there a connection between those two Oklahoma heists with Murray to either of them? The July 14 Brownsville Herald brought us blonde-haired girl, 19, arrested when bank robbery fails. The story takes us to Saginaw, Michigan, where we see, quote, blonde, bobbed-haired, and defiant, end quote. A 19-year-old girl was held after unsuccessfully robbing the People's Savings Bank. She was specifically after $5,000. Well, she walked into the bank, coolly aimed a, quote, decrepit revolver, end quote, at E. Speckhart, who was a teller. She had also pushed a $5,000 check that was signed, quote, make it snappy, end quote, through the window, and commanded the teller to indeed give her that very specific $5,000. Speckhart immediately dropped to his knees behind the counter and pressed the burglar alarm. Within seconds, police and, quote, several hundred pedestrians flocking around, end quote, rushed into the bank and quickly disarmed her. She then fell into the patrolman's arms and began to cry. She later gave her name as Viola Harris of Flint, Michigan, though police follow-up determined that she was unknown there. Quote, I needed the money to pay off a mortgage, end quote. She told police and figured that would be the easy way to get it. The Brownsville Herald on July 7th brought us 5 are held in robberies. Subtitled, Prominent Citizens are Involved in Charges. Off to Amarillo, Texas, where we see 3 men were facing burglary and theft charges connected with the attempted robbery of the First State Bank of Vega, Texas, as well as several home burglaries in the Amarillo area. Now, they note that there were 3 men facing those charges, but then they listed 4. Among them were George Burgess from Amarillo, Texas, alias E.C. Bergman, who was, of all things, a prominent oil geologist, a Glenn L. Brunner, who was a prominent Kansas City attorney, a William Gugler, alias L.O. Gaylor, alias L.W. Yeager, alias A.T. Heavy Johnson, and Lawrence Gugler, and lastly, a James Watson who was being held at Benjamin, Texas. In fact, 3 of that quartet had been arrested in Benjamin in connection with a robbery of a bank there. Police had a felony warrant for Brunner by the Chief of Police H.L. Gaither of Amarillo. Well, there was a small additional follow-up story, and it noted that attorney is involved. Glenn L. Brunnen, who I assume is Glenn L. Brunner in the story above, was charged with being an accomplice to the robbery of the First State Bank at Truscott that occurred on June 27th. He was in custody back in Amarillo, and most of the $2,000 that had been taken from Truscott had been recovered. We introduced the Truscott heist in the June 1927 quick hitter video Machine Guns, Murder, Mistaken Moonshine that we noted earlier. Well, the Cordell Dispatch from July 20th ran 2 years reformed is taken for crime. It involves Leo M. Harrison, who was arrested on the evening of July 18th in Richmond, Virginia. He was arrested for his connection with the robbery of the Van Deventer Trust Company that occurred back on February 7, 1925. During that heist, he, quote, slugged his stepbrother, Harry B. Givens, end quote, who was the secretary of the institution. Oh yeah, he took $18,000 in cash and $12,000 in securities as well. At the time, Harrison was unemployed, and for some reason, he visited the bank and found his stepbrother Givens alone. So it seems like a crime of opportunity, yet we see that he struck him twice over the head with a bag of buckshot, drew a revolver threatening to shoot him. Then he tied Givens' hands together and locked him in a washroom. So maybe not a crime of opportunity. Well, he took 2 cash boxes containing all that loot. There's another, I think, error-laden story that follows. Confessed deed, police assert. Leo M., that's Leo Matthews Harrison, 27, was known as a, quote, respectable poultryman, end quote, who'd raised chickens on a modest poultry ranch and was being held on bank robbery charges. He was being charged with the heist of the Vanderventer Trust Company of St. Louis, Missouri on January 8, 1924 for $30,000. So is this an additional heist a year earlier? Actually, he was arrested at another bank where he was arranging a loan using some of the alleged stolen stock. The Evening Star from July 28th ran Posse Continues Hunt for 2 Desperados. Subtitled, One is Accused of Killing Man in Quarrel After Game of Cards. This takes us to Marshall, Arkansas. We see that 2 notorious desperados somehow continue to elude Searcy County officers and citizens during a manhunt that began Tuesday night. The hunt began at St. Joe. Lee Sitton, who'd been released from the state penitentiary recently after serving 5 of his 15-year sentence for bank robbery, and Troy Love, who'd escaped from an Arkansas prison previously while serving his sentence for burglary and grand larceny, appeared to have teamed up. This whole situation arose when Sitton shot and killed Dewey Baker, who was only 26, in an altercation at St. Joe following a card game. A stray shot actually hit bystander Joe Manns, age 50. Now, officers were aware that Love was in the area and assumed that he and Sitton had teamed up, and they also knew that they would fight hard if they were cordoned off or captured. The July 27 Indianapolis Times brought us admits bank robbery, and it takes us to Portland, Indiana, where we learn that Merle Yoakum, age 30, confessed at Cleveland, Ohio, that he was one of several men who robbed the National Bank of Rockford, Ohio, of about almost $2,600, what they said was approximately a week ago. The July 29 Producers News ran 5 to 20 years given bank robbers, subtitled, Wife of Buck Mitchell, who accompanied them in flight, not prosecuted. Loot recovered, except for $3. We see that Adrian Buck Mitchell, Fred Gardner, J.L. Buckley was the trio that held up and robbed the First State Bank of Bynum. They'd been captured on a Thursday morning by a farmer's posse. By Saturday afternoon, they'd been sent in front of Judge J.J. Green in Teton County District Court at Choteau and had been sentenced between 5 and 20 years each in the state prison. When they were arrested, the 3 were accompanied by Mrs. Adrian Mitchell, who assisted the authorities in actually recovering the money. She wasn't present during the heist and was not criminally implicated, therefore she was released. So here's how the heist went down. Miss Benna Horrocks, a bookkeeper, was alone at the institution at around 3 p.m. on Tuesday. 2 men entered the bank. One commanded her to silence and held her at gunpoint. Horrocks attempted to hide behind the counter, but was prevented from pressing the alarm by a bandit who leaped over the counter and met her there. At that point, the 2 robbers threatened to lock her in the vault, but she protested, so they compromised by binding her hands. Then they grabbed $1,500 in currency, for some reason avoiding silver and Liberty bonds. Well, the 2 men fled, and they hadn't even gotten out the door when Horrocks loosed herself from the binds and hit the alarm button. The bandits leaped into the car, which was allegedly occupied by Mrs. Mitchell and the third man. So I'm not sure how she gets out of this scot-free. Well, off they fled to the North Fork of Teton Canyon. A posse immediately formed and was only about a half mile or so behind the bandits when the car pursuers were using sprung a flat tire. Well, the bandits abandoned their car about 15 miles or so west of Bynum and apparently headed out on foot through the heavy timber, quote, in the foothills of the Continental Divide, end quote. Sheriff J.L. Collins recruited that 20-plus members of the posse, and a 50-hour search was conducted before the bandits were apprehended, quote, half-starved, end quote, 20 miles west of Bynum, coincidentally near the sheriff's ranch home. Well, these stories may not have been prominent, but their absurdity certainly lingers on. From teddy bears to stepbrother beatdowns and card game killings. Bank robbery wasn't just for hardened gunmen, and July 1927 proved that it could still be deadly, daring, and always downright desperate. Now, stick around. Next up, we meet another femme fatale bandit queen and take a trip into the wilds of Appalachia with a descent into the Devil's Hole Mountain.